Presentation is Academic English Language Proficiency. And I've made up a new acronym because I know we need one in this industry. Yeah? We don't have very many at all, do we? So I've made up another one. So I'm going to call Academic English Language Proficiency AELP. Okay? It's an easy one. There will be a test at the end. So what is this thing called Academic English Language Proficiency? And I'm going to start by building the case that we need to know more about AELP. As ELACOS providers, we need to know about this construct. And why do we need to know? Brett Blacker, the CEO of English Australia, a couple of weeks ago, provided me with the data that shows what do students do after they've studied ELACOS. You may be familiar with this data. About 30% do ELACOS only, and then we don't really know what they're doing it for or where they go next, so let's just ignore those. But in fact, all of the rest arguably require AELP, Academic English Language Proficiency. Certainly the 36% who are going on to higher ed, they definitely need AELP. I think arguably the ones going to school also need AELP. The non-award, that often means foundation. So arguably they need Academic English Language Proficiency. That it really depends what kind of course they're going on to, but certainly a large number would need Academic English Language Proficiency. So there's between, I don't know, 45 and 70% of our students nationally who go from ELACOS and they go on to further or higher education, and they need to know language proficiency in an academic context. So, large numbers of ELACOS students need Academic English Language Proficiency for further study. In my institution at Macquarie University, it's about 90% that go on to the university, and maybe in your institution it's similarly very high. So I'd just like you to tell your partner what percentage of students in your centre require Academic English Language Proficiency, in your view, I guess it depends on the kind of provider that you work for. But if you are in a university, then I would imagine it's pretty high, similar to what I mentioned for my institution. So I hope I built the case that ELACOS students do need, and we need as teachers in the ELACOS sector, we do need to understand the construct of AELP. I also believe very strongly that we need to understand theory. So I'd just like to build the case of why theory matters. As teachers, and I haven't been in the classroom on a full-time basis for quite a long time, but in my heart I'm still a teacher. And as teachers and practitioners, I think on a day-to-day basis, we don't think about theory, of course. It becomes implicit. We study it when we do our CELTA and our DELTA and whatever else we've done, DipEd, and then we kind of forget about it. It becomes implicit. And I suppose that's how it should be. But I think it's really important from time to time that we think explicitly about theory, that we continue to read, that we continue to engage by coming to PD Fests, you've ticked the box, and that even though as ELACOS teachers we may not be research active, we should definitely be research engaged. Okay? And I think that's really important, not research active necessarily, but research engaged. We continue to refresh, we continue to understand the theory that underpins what we do. Now, when I started teaching, a long time ago, nobody was studying EAP in the places that I worked. Nobody. It was all general English. I did FCE, CAE, CPE. And it was only until, it was about 1995 that somebody mentioned this boutique test called IELTS. Anybody heard of it? That we started to think about this thing called AELP. That's not the case now. That's not the case now. I'm sure you've seen it in your institutions that there's been a massive move away from general English for a variety of reasons, but that Academic English Language Proficiency in EAP is now much greater. But I think theory is important because if the teaching is the house, we need to make sure that what we do in the classroom is built on a solid foundation. Theory is the solid foundation. Without it, this is what happens when the rain comes. When the problems come, when the queries come, when you're a little bit worried about something, students ask you something you don't know the answer to, if it's not built on a strong foundation, it's not built on theory, then your house gets carried down the river. Okay? So I believe very strongly that as practitioners we need to ensure that from time to time we engage with theory. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to present to you a number of theories and a number of conceptual frameworks in the next 20 minutes or so. There won't be a test at the end, I promise you, but I am happy to share my slides if you'd like that. And I'm going to start with some theories that you will know very well. And I'm doing that for two reasons. One, because we should always, as teachers, move from the known to the unknown. But also, when we come to some of the conceptual frameworks that I'm going to talk about later, you'll see that they're underpinned by these frameworks that you already know very well. So I'm going to start with the communicative competence theory by Canali and Swain. They didn't create the term, they didn't coin the term communicative competence, that of course was Hymes. But it was Canali and Swain who first put it together into a framework, pretty little picture like this, okay? And I know you're all very familiar with it, but I'd just like to very quickly refresh our understanding of this framework. The key thing here was that communicative competence, and I'm going to use the term communicative competence and English language proficiency interchangeably today. They're more or less synonymous, so I'm not going to go into the difference. Their framework showed that communicative competence was not a unitary trait, not a single trait, but it was multi-componential. It involved grammatical competence, discourse competence, sociolinguistic competence, and strategic competence. Grammatical competence is not just grammar. Remember, it's not just grammar. It is the various nuts and bolts, grammar, words, morphology, semantics, phonology. It's the nuts and bolts that make up language. And those of you who, I don't know if there are any very new teachers in the room or there are some CELTA trainers in the room, new teachers tend to focus very much here, don't they? Or perhaps you remember when you were a new teacher, you were very much obsessed about, oh, when do we use the present perfect? Well, it's the simple past. Okay, and we learned that, and then we realized there's all sorts of other things actually that we need to understand about language. It's not just about the nuts and bolts. Then we move on to learn a little bit more about discourse. And when I say discourse, I mean text. Yeah, I mean text, whether spoken or written. Discourse is language usually above the sentence level, paragraphs, whole text. Discourse is where we find out about genre. It's where we think about coherence, cohesion, how language sticks together and works together above the nuts and bolts level. Sociolinguistic, you'll remember that's about appropriacy of language in certain contexts. And strategic competence is the strategies that we use. So today, when I lose a word, I'm going to have to find a strategy. I'm going to have to find another word, avoidance strategies, guessing, paraphrasing, circumlocution. These are all the strategic competencies that we use when we get into trouble. So Canali and Swain was probably the first and the seminal framework. You might be more familiar with the Bachman model. This is a simplified version of the Bachman model. Bachman took strategic competence out. He said that's not part of language, actually. Those strategies it is a competence, an important competence, but those strategies are not part of language per se. This was a more elaborate model. You'll see that he subdivided it into the organizational and the pragmatic. So the what, the nuts and bolts, and the how, if you like. In many ways, it's fairly similar. I don't want to go into great detail today about the difference between this and the Canali and Swain, but a lot of similarities. We've still got the grammatical, the nuts and the bolts. We've still got discourse or textual. We've still got the sociolinguistic over here, and here we've got illocutionary. Illocutionary is about what is it you want to mean. Okay, so for example, if I say, it's hot in here, am I just commenting on the temperature, or do I mean, please somebody turn on the aircon, or I need to take off my cardi, or what do I mean by that? There are a number of other models connected to communicative competence or communicative language ability with all sorts of different terms. We're not going to get into terminology today. A lot of them you may be familiar with the Cels-Mercier and Dornier model. You may be familiar with the Purpura model. There's a whole plethora of them, actually. This is the one that probably has the most traction. Before I move on, what I think is actually quite interesting, we know that language is multidimensional from these. What we don't know, though, and it's quite interesting given how long ago it was that these models were put together, we don't know how these different competencies interact. We don't know their relative weight. We don't know whether sociolinguistic competence is more important than grammatical competence. We don't know whether you need a certain amount of grammatical competence before you can have sociolinguistic. I've got an opinion about it, but there's no theory that really talks to that, which I think is quite fascinating after all this time. Okay, so I'm going to assume that you kind of know that, all right? And we're going to move on. When I started my PhD, I wanted to look at the construct of academic English language proficiency in higher education. At the time, I was working in higher ed rather than ELICOS, and I was looking for a model, something like this, but that described academic English language proficiency. And this was about 2008-ish, I guess, when I first started reading the literature, and I didn't find very much, actually. And then I found some work by Cummins. Who's familiar with the work of Jim Cummins, the BICS and CALP? Okay, quite a few of you, okay. So I found the work of Jim Cummins. Jim Cummins was actually working with children, immigrant children in the UK and the US and Canada. So it isn't a theory and a conceptual framework for adults specifically, but I think that there are some things that we can learn from it. So Cummins talked about BICS, which is basic interpersonal communication skills, and CALP, which is cognitive academic language proficiency. I wish he'd made them a bit more parallel. They're not very parallel, but let's unpack these terms a little bit. So basic interpersonal communication skills, when he says basic, he means everyday. He means the kind of interactions that happen between children at school and their peers, children and their teachers. It's the everyday language, the vernacular language that children needed to communicate in school. And he was thinking about children who were perhaps from a Spanish-speaking background, for example, and they went to an English-speaking school in the US. And he contrasted that with cognitive academic language proficiency. And you can already see the word cognitive immediately makes you realize that it is intellectually more demanding. Okay, and the context is for academic language situations. So the language that children need in order to read, write, listen, and speak within the school context. Okay, and what Cummins found was that some of these, some children were acquiring BICS relatively quickly, but they weren't acquiring CALP quite so quickly. Is anybody working in the schools sector? Mm-hmm. So you'll be very familiar with that. Yeah. Okay. And in fact, he found that they had very different development trajectories. So BICS was acquired between 1 to 3 years. So children had this kind of surface fluency, and everybody thought their language was fine. But actually in their written work and their reading, it was taking them many more years to reach grade norms of their native speaker peers. Okay? And personally, I've experienced that. I didn't know the theory. A few years ago, I was working in Singapore, and I was working for a very dodgy private provider at the time. I was early in my career, and I needed to do an awful lot of private lessons. And I used to teach kids who were going to the international schools. And I remember this girl who I was very, very fond of this girl. I started to teach her when she was 11. I taught her till she was 14. And in the first 6 months, I was amazed. She was like a sponge. She sucked up all this stuff. And I didn't realize that actually what it was BICS at the time. And I was continually surprised at how poor her writing was when she spoke and listened so well. And I didn't understand what the difference was at the time, but it was the difference between BICS and CALP. Now, this is for children. It's not for adults. But I think there are some learnings that there may be some transfer of skills there. Okay, so we've looked at a few conceptual theories, but what I wanted to find was some theories related to adults. And for a long time, I didn't find anything, actually. And that's not to say that we didn't know anything about academic English language proficiency for adults. Of course, we've known about genre theory, both Hallidayan and Swalesian, for many decades. And we know a lot about discourse analysis, and we've got linguistic corpora. So of course we know about EAP. And I think this quote by Hyland really sums up. He says, academic writing is not a single undifferentiated mass, but a variety of subject-specific literacies. So we know that there are differences between subjects, there are differences between disciplines. For example, just this table just shows some of the differences between the disciplines. So for example, the hard sciences, they don't tend to use hedging language very much, for example. They tend to be a lot more objective. Lexical density is higher in the hard sciences than it is in the humanities and the social sciences, for example. So we've known about these disciplinary differences for a very long time. So I'm not suggesting that we didn't know anything about academic English language proficiency, but I was really looking for a conceptual framework, and I didn't find very much. So there was really nothing around. And I was looking for conceptual frameworks for adults in higher education. And suddenly, in 2010, was the beginning of a plethora of them. And if we have time later, we can talk about why it is. But I'm just going to float something with you now. It didn't start till 2010, and it was entirely in Australia. So have a bit of a think as I'm speaking why that was the case. Why was it 2010 before we started to get these frameworks? And why were they all in Australia? So I'm going to show you 4 models, okay? 4 models from higher ed. The first one was devised by Neil Murray, who was working at UniSA at the time. And he calls it a tripartite division of competencies. And that's because academics always like to use big words, okay? Now, we're linguists, so we know that tripartite just means that there's 3 bits to it, right? Okay, so there's 3 bits to this model. And in his model, he has English language proficiency at the bottom. And then he has academic literacies and professional literacies here. So there are 3 parts. And in his paper, he describes English language proficiency using the Bachman model. You see, we're back to Bachman, okay? And in his model, he believes that English language proficiency generally, you need a certain foundation, you need a certain threshold, and that ability can be cashed in, it is a prerequisite, to moving on to academic literacies or professional literacies. So in this way, Murray is what might be described as a thresholdist. I made that word up, but I quite like it. Okay, he believes there is a threshold of English language proficiency that you need before you can go on to these other skills, these other literacies. Okay, and I'd like you to be thinking to yourself, do I think that? I'm just going to explain academic literacies a little bit. If you're interested in academic literacies, and yes, they are plural, I highly recommend that you read the seminal work by Lear and Street, 98 and 2000. It's in my reference list at the end. Academic literacies is built up of 3 different levels of literacies. It's not just a repertoire of study skills. Okay, that's the lowest level. It's not just about academic socialization. It's more than that. It is a repertoire of skills. It is about academic socialization, but it's also a higher order. It's about being able to write and say what you want to say, that illocutionary force, that pragmatic competence. It's about having power and the power to say what you want to mean in the academic context. So, I'd like to know whether you think that there is a threshold. So, quick discussion to your partner. Is there a threshold of English language proficiency that's needed before you can go on to develop academic literacies and professional literacies? Of course, because this is academia, a year later, somebody critiqued this model. Of course, Harper, Prentice and Wilson the next year critiqued this model for its vertical conception of language proficiency and these competencies. And they came up with their own. Of course they did. Okay, and in this model, it's not vertical. Harper, Prentice and Wilson, 2011, believe that there's a generic core of knowledge of grammar and vocabulary, and that there are still 3 literacies. Notice they don't actually use the term language proficiency. They use the term everyday literacies. But they believe that these skills, these literacies, can develop simultaneously. Perhaps not evenly, but simultaneously. Is it possible to begin to develop academic literacy when your everyday literacies are very low? So let's have a bit of a show of hands. Who's the thresholdist? Thresholdist. Okay. Hands up, you're a simultaneous whateverist. Hands up, I don't know. Hands up, I don't think it's dichotomous. Ah, okay. All right. Now, in this model, again, they refer back to the academic literacies, the Lear and Street, and that's because the work that they do is in academic literacies, so that's something that underpins all of their work. So, 2 models there. The third model came out in 2012. This was O'Loughlin and Arkoudis, and they took a slightly different approach. Their approach was chronological, according to the student life cycle in higher ed. So they looked at entry to higher ed, what they called experience, which means during higher ed, and exit, which means graduation. Okay, so we're talking about higher ed students here in the student life cycle. And what I think is really interesting is that in all 3, they talk about the need for social communicative language ability. Remember Cummins? Remember Bix? At all 3 levels, they need social communicative language ability. Just have a bit of a think in any of your EAP programs. Do you develop social communicative language ability? Or do you spend an awful lot of time on the academic side and not quite enough on the social? I don't know. They say that at entry, students need general academic language ability, but that changes. During their degrees, they need specific disciplinary academic ability. And towards exit, they need to start developing professional literacies as they prepare for their profession. Okay? And again, here we see that this model is underpinned by the Bachman model that we referred to earlier. There's one more model that I'd like to introduce to you. I love this model. This model was created by Ahmar Mahboob. Do any of you know Ahmar? Okay. He actually works at the University of Sydney. He's a systemic functional linguist, and you can see the influence of SFL in this model. He also is a proponent of World Englishes. And this model is not meant to describe academic English language proficiency, but it does as part of it. This model is meant to describe how language varies, okay? And it varies, in his view, according to user, use, and mode. So let's unpack that a little bit. So user, it depends who's speaking to who, the language that we choose, right? So if we're talking to our mum, it's quite different to when I'm talking to my boss, all right? So he talks about low social distance, mum, high social distance, actually, that's not my boss. My boss is probably here-ish. But the VC, perhaps, at the university, high social distance, okay? And he talks about the location and the relationship between the users. Language will change according to who we are speaking to. He also says that it will change according to the use. Is it an everyday casual vernacular, or is it specialized and technical? And the language will change. The language will also change depending on whether it's written or spoken, okay? And together, these provide 8 different domains of use, like this. With a partner, I'd like you to find me the 2 that are academic English language proficiency. Okay, which 2? I don't know whether you agree with me, but I think it's the bottom 2. Initially, I only highlighted the last one, but I should have highlighted the penultimate one as well, because of course they're spoken, yeah? All right. And it's quite interesting, perhaps back in your staff rooms next week, you can go through and plot some other context, some other language use, and to see where they would be within those 8 domains. I think it's really quite a fascinating model. So to summarize, in higher ed, we have no empirically validated or agreed upon model, which kind of suggests that we're operating in a fairly a-theoretical space, i.e. without theory. There's no single model that we talk about in higher ed. A lot of people talk about the academic literacies approach, but that doesn't encompass the language proficiency bit totally. All of the models that I showed you, though, were underpinned by existing theories. Okay? What I'd like you to do really quickly is, I showed you 4 different ones, and they were all quite different, but there were some similarities. Did you notice there were some similarities between them? Yeah, even though some are circles and some are lines and some are... Okay. So what I'd like you to do very quickly with your partner is come up with a few similarities. If we try and bring it all together, what would we see? What's similar about all of them? Some of the similarities, I hope you noticed, are that they all talked about multidimensionality. Yeah? And they talked about different contexts of use, using language in different contexts. Not all of them, but some of them talked about the fact that there are higher expectations in later stages of the student life cycle. And we have to remember that within the ELICOS sector, because some of these things are not necessarily relevant for ELICOS. This was higher ed. Okay? So I'm going to show you, how are you going with the eyes glazing over? We're all good? Yes. Yeah, we're all good? Okay. I'm going to show you one more model. Personally, I think this is the best model. This heuristic tries to bring together everything that we've looked at today. It tries to bring together the Canalian Swain and the Bachman. It tries to bring together all of those conceptual frameworks that we saw in higher ed, okay? So along this continuum, we have what I've called the competencies. So we've got the linguistic. I could have called it grammatical, but I didn't, because people sometimes think that it just means grammar. So I used the word linguistic. I used discourse, and I used socio-pragmatic. I think you know what those terms mean now. I used those 3 along this continuum to describe competencies. And I took this from the literature in ELT, in TESOL. And along this continuum, I described 3 contexts of use. Everyday, I could have said social or vernacular, the academic, and the professional. Okay? And therefore, we've got a kind of 3 by 3. And then here we've got the improvement in proficiency over time. So it's 3-dimensional because of time. So for example, at time 1, and you can decide what time 1 is, it may be the beginning of your EAP class, it may be the beginning of higher ed, you decide when time 1 is. At time 1, the student's ability, their competence, may vary according to the context of use. Their everyday abilities may be better than their academic and are probably going to be better than their professional. That might not be the case, though, because every student is different. Some students are stronger in the academic domain than the everyday, right? So it might not be like this. It might be more like this, a bit hiddledy-piddledy. And yes, that's the technical term. Okay, so this is time 1. I'll just go back to this one, time 1, yeah? Now, however long the course is, and whether we're talking about ELICOS or whether we're talking about higher ed, by time 2, whenever time 2 is, we would expect students to have improved. Yes? Hopefully in all domains, all competencies in all contexts of use. By the time they graduate, one would hope that their everyday and their academic were at a pretty high level. Professional maybe a bit lower, maybe. And again, it depends on the student, and it could be hiddledy-piddledy, okay? It depends on the student. Jagged. I like hiddledy-piddledy, Darren. I've coined it. Okay. So I'd just like to talk a little bit, moving from the theory to principled practice. What can you do with this model? Okay, what can you do with it? And I think you can use it in a number of ways. You can use the model to map coverage of course content. You could also use it to track student strengths and weaknesses in these different areas. So let me show you for the first one. If we take the 3D model and we do something really clever, are you watching? Just watch. Really clever, right? I've made it 2-dimensional there. It's just a basic table. Just switched it around. Okay, and now we've got the competencies here and the context of use here. Just a basic 3-by-3 table. When you write your curriculum, even a lesson, well, I don't suppose it matters at the lesson level, but certainly across a program, you might want to consider, have you covered off all of these different competencies and contexts of use? Okay. Now in ELICOS, you might argue, it's not our responsibility to do the professional context of use. So you might decide, it's fine that my mapping looks like that. Okay? That is fine. But the important thing is that it's intentional and it's not just a gap, right? So one thing that I think might be a gap in ELICOS is the everyday. I think once they leave general English, often when they get into EAP, direct entry, sometimes we forget about that social communicative language ability that students still need. If they can't make friends and talk to peers when they go to uni, they're stuffed. Okay, it's really important. Okay. So what I wanted to do, I've got 3 slides and I wanted to show you, in the academic context of use, I wanted to show you a couple of examples of ways in which you can operationalize the linguistic, the discourse, and the socio-pragmatic. I'm sure that you're doing some of these things anyway, and if you are, you can puff up your chest and feel really good by the end of the session, okay? All right, so I'm going to start with, in the academic context of use, I'm going to start with linguistic. What can we do to support the linguistic, the development of linguistic competence in the academic context? Well, one thing that we can do is to create communicative tasks, and I do mean communicative tasks, I don't mean learning lots of word lists, around word lists, such as the general academic word list, the Coxhead that's been around for forever, and also some of the discipline-specific word lists. There are lots of them, and they keep being published. Last time I was reading, there were dozens of these academic word lists that were coming out for accountants, for science, for environment. Get the word lists. If you're teaching students who are going into science or environment, introduce them to those word lists. But again, I want to emphasize you do need to make communicative tasks, not just give them the list to go away and learn verbatim, okay? So that's one way that we can develop linguistic competence in the academic domain that is theoretically underpinned, not just native speaker intuition, which is a very dangerous thing, okay? For discourse competence, I'm sure you already do this, but we should provide students with lots of examples of academic text within higher ed. One way that you can do that is use some of the many corpora that are available. I'm not sure if you're aware of the Michigan corpus. There are many corpuses. Can I say corpuses? I just did. Okay, go and have a look at the MyCusp, MyCase. There are many corpuses, corpora around, and you can show students examples and not just show them, but deconstruct the genre. What does it look like? But most importantly, because I think the one that is often neglected is the socio-pragmatic competence, because it's the hardest to do, isn't it? The grammatical competence, the linguistic competence, is the easiest to do. We're all really comfortable with that. We're comfortable with the discourse competence. We're less comfortable, I think, with socio-pragmatic. So going back to the MacBoob with the user use mode, I recommend that you develop activities for practice and reflection on language variation by user, that's who's using it, by use, and by mode. And I've color-coded them, so user is red, use is blue, mode is green, in a couple of examples here. So, for example, verbal queries about a university assessment task with a peer. What language would be used if it was spoken, it's verbal, it's about an assessment task with a peer? And then what you need to do is change some of those variables. If you change the verbal to written, how would the language change? If you change peer to lecturer, how does the language change? And in that way, if you have these conversations with students, they'll begin to understand some of the pragmatic differences, the appropriacy of language in different contexts, different users. Let's take the second one. It's an email, and the student's writing some queries about a concept to their lecturer. If we change email to some other mode, how does the language change if it was a face-to-face conversation? If it's not a lecturer, but it's their friend, it's their peer, how does the language change? A discussion about a social event. They're organizing a social event with a friend by phone. If you change any of those variables, how does the language change? If they want to invite their teacher to the social event, would the language be different to when they're speaking to their friends? So these are ways that we can do some role plays and then zoom in on the language. What has changed? I asked you earlier, do you know why those models were all between 2010 and 2015-ish and all in Australia? Would anybody like to suggest the reason why? Anybody heard of Birrell, the Birrell report? Yes? The Birrell report came out in 2006. Birrell was commissioned by the government to look at the graduate skilled migration categories. And as a byproduct of this work, he looked at the IELTS test scores of students who had graduated from an Australian university and then taken IELTS to apply for their graduate skill migration visa. And 42% of Chinese students, for example, applied with a 5.5. Okay, and that was the catalyst for a lot of debate in higher ed. Everyone was thinking, what? We had assumed until that point that students were graduating with the magical IELTS 7, the CEFR C1. And here was some evidence to show that that was not the case. So there was a lot of research and publications and conceptual models that came out as a result of that from 2010 onwards. And all in Australia, because we are focused on it in a way that other countries just are not. Anyway, I've talked too much. A question. Does anybody have a question? Yes?
You put professional above academic.
Not above. I was thinking chronologically, really, that students learn the everyday first. They tend to go to general English before they'd go to an EAP class, for example. Then they would go to uni and do the EAP, they need the academic. And the professional, I was thinking chronologically, when they start work afterwards. That's why. I'm not prioritizing it. It's not hierarchical. It's not hierarchical. Good point. Thank you for allowing that for me to clarify. Yeah, Patrick.
Pamela, yeah, great presentation. I'm interested to hear your take on the influence of threshold tests in all of this, in the frameworks, in your research.
For entry to higher ed?
Yes.
How long have you got? Okay. So, disclaimer, I was involved in IELTS for 22 years, okay? I was assistant principal examiner until last year, and I think it's a fantastic test. However, when I used to do the graduations for our direct entry program at my previous place, I used to come and say them to the students. I used to say, you know, direct entry is very bad for my IELTS business, which it was because they were all doing direct entry and not taking IELTS. But I firmly believe that a program like a direct entry program is so much better for students than just to go and take a language proficiency test. And that's not the fault of the test, okay? A language proficiency test is just that. It is only intended to measure language proficiency, okay, at entry. Yeah? It is not supposed to be indicative of academic success. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to do the other part of my PhD, which was we tested students at graduation and looked at their IELTS scores at graduation, and I looked at how much language acquisition occurred, how much improvement occurred as measured by IELTS across their degree. And it was worrying. It was 0.3 of a band score across 3 years, which is worrying in of itself. But the point is that language proficiency is a necessary but not sufficient skill and competence for academic success. And I think very often people forget that. We're going to have a conversation about it next week, I think. That tests, threshold tests, are just one way in which we can measure one component. But I firmly believe that in direct entry programs we can prepare students much better through a range of skills. Although I would just like to say, since I've got the conch this morning, I also think that we have to be careful in direct entry programs that we don't stray too far from our raison d'etre, which is to improve their language proficiency. It's great if we can teach them the academic literacies as well, and yes, they need it, but it should never be at the expense of bringing their language proficiency up to the minimum standard that they require to go into university. Okay. Is there maybe one more question? No, there isn't one more question. Okay.